We've created a compost pile for several reasons. Maybe we're wanting to create a soil amendment to add to our garden or landscape, or maybe we're wanting to reduce the amount of organic waste that we put into the landfill. Well, we've done everything right, but for some reason we're still having troubles with our compost pile. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Hello, I'm Richard Parrish. I'm the County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Leon County, and we're going to talk about some of those problems you might have with your compost pile and how to solve those problems. There's a variety of potential problems you could have with your compost pile. There might be an ammonia smell coming from the compost pile, or maybe your compost bin smells of rotten eggs. Maybe your compost is dripping wet and soggy, or maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe it's bone dry and dusty. In order to create compost fairly quickly, it needs to be hot. Well, maybe your compost pile isn't heating up. Or maybe you go out to your compost bin and you find it covered in mold and fungus. Or maybe you go out to your compost pile and you see it's just covered in bugs, or maybe critters. Birds and snakes and lizards and frogs and mice and squirrels and raccoons. Maybe those type of critters are getting into your compost bin. Or maybe you go out to your compost pile and you see plants growing in your compost pile. Well, we're going to talk about each of these potential problems and how to solve those problems. Well, let's start with an ammonia smell. Maybe you go out to your compost bin and it just smells of ammonia. Well, the potential cause for this ammonia smell is that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is too low. There is not enough available brown feedstock, or there's not enough available carbon compared to the amount of nitrogen or the amount of green feedstock that's in your compost pile. This is a problem because all of the nitrogen atoms in the ammonia gas, and that's what you're smelling, can no longer be absorbed by the plants. Ammonia is toxic to plants, and it can kill those plants if bad compost is applied prematurely. So we want to make sure that we correct the ammonia smell problem with our compost pile so that we're not adding a potential toxin to our plants later on. Well, if we have an ammonia smell to our compost bin, what can we do? Well, the solution is to mix in more carbon feedstock to balance out the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Then that carbon feedstock might be stuff such as leaves or shredded paper, some of that carbon material. So balance out your carbon nitrogen ratio and you're going to eliminate that ammonia smell. Well, maybe ammonia smell is not the problem. Maybe your compost bin has a rotten egg smell. Well, there's two potential causes for a rotten egg smell. Maybe the compost bin or the compost pile is too compact, or the material in the compost pile is just too packed and it doesn't allow airflow through it, or maybe there is too much moisture in your pile. Those are two potential causes for the rotten egg smell. Well, this is a problem because this means that your pile is going anaerobic. There's not enough oxygen in your pile, and the bad microbes are replacing the good microbes. So in order to fix the rotten egg smell in your compost pile, you want to turn the pile. And by turning the pile, you're going to be introducing oxygen into the pile, and also you want to add some more brown bulking agents or add some more carbon to your compost pile. Another problem we might have with our compost pile is maybe our compost is too wet. Well, there are several potential causes for having a compost pile that is too wet. Maybe depending upon where you have located the compost bin, maybe you've got some site drainage issues. Maybe it's a low spot in the property and it gathers or collects water, or the water doesn't drain depending upon the soil type that you have. So maybe there's some drainage issues. Maybe you have a compacted compost matrix. The material in your compost bin is just very tight and compacted. Oxygen can't get through, water can't seep out. Maybe you have too much green feedstock or too much nitrogen material in your compost bin, or maybe You've recently experienced a lot of rain and you've had too much rain fall over the top of your compost bin. If the compost pile is too wet, it cannot heat up properly, and this could lead to some anaerobic conditions, releasing methane gas within your compost pile. So some ways to fix a compost pile that is too wet. If you're having some site drainage issues, maybe move that pile away from those low-lying areas. If your compost pile is too compacted, maybe turn the pile. If you've got too much green feedstock in your pile, mix in some brown feedstock or mix in some carbon feedstock. And if you've had too much rain, maybe cover it with a tarp before the next rain to prevent more moisture from getting into that compost bin. And another solution if you've got too much rain is after that rain stops, wait a few days. And if you've got good drainage, that compost pile should dry up. You want it to remain moist, but you don't want it to be sopping wet. Maybe you find that your compost pile is too dry. Well, there are some potential causes for a dry compost pile. Maybe we've been experiencing some drought situations and there hasn't been enough rain. Or maybe the brown or the carbon material that you've been adding to your compost pile is too big, and as a result it allows that water to flow right on through, thus drying out your compost bin fairly quickly. Or maybe there's not enough nitrogen in your pile, or maybe the pile is too small to hold moisture. So these are all some potential causes for a dry compost bin. If the compost pile is too dry, it cannot heat up very well, and that will slow down the decomposition process, thus causing it to be a longer turnaround time between when you make your compost to when you can actually harvest and use your compost in your garden or landscape. So some potential solutions to correct a dry compost pile. If there's not enough rain, take the water hose out there and actually irrigate or water your compost pile. If you've been using too big of browns or the bulking agents are too large, mix in smaller browns. Maybe mix in some leaves or some smaller twigs. Take those large bulking agents and make them smaller, chop them up, make them smaller so that that pile can hold water and you're not going to lose the water as fast. If you don't have enough nitrogen in the pile, add some more green feedstock or add some more nitrogen into your pile. And if your pile is too small, build your pile up. Ideally, a pile should be 3 foot long by 3 foot wide by 3 foot tall. That's an ideal size to get the pile to heat up. It's a workable size, and that will prevent your pile from going too dry. We talked about the pile needing to heat up in order for that decomposition to take place, and the hot pile causes that decomposition to occur faster, but maybe the pile is not heating up. Well, if the pile is not heating up, maybe there's not enough moisture, or maybe there's not enough aeration or oxygen. Maybe there's not enough nitrogen, or maybe the pile is just too small, or quite possibly the compost could be finished. Well, if the compost pile cannot heat up, weed seeds and other pathogens won't get pasteurized, or they won't be killed, so you run the risk of transferring those weed seeds and other pathogens to your garden and landscape. So some solutions for a compost pile that won't heat up is if the problem is not enough moisture, irrigate the pile, water the pile, drag the water hose out and add some water to it. If there's not enough aeration in the pile, turn the pile, get your pitchfork, get your shovel, turn the pile. If there's not enough nitrogen, add some green feedstock. If the pile is too small, add more feedstock. Make that pile 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. And if your compost pile is finished, well then by all means put it to use. Put it to use in your garden or put it to use in your landscape. You might walk out to your compost pile and you realize that there's mold growing on the surface. Well, mold growing on the surface of a compost pile could mean that there's too much moisture, or maybe that the food is exposed or it's not buried deep enough. So this alone isn't too much of an issue. If anything, exposed food just isn't getting the carbon pairing that it needs. So some solutions is to turn the pile, maybe add some more browns and cover the pile. And so by covering that food waste, you're going to be eliminating the environment that is ideal for the mold to grow. You walk out to your compost pile and chances are you're going to see bugs. Bugs can be caused by inappropriate greens, or maybe there's a food that is exposed or not buried deep enough. Now, bugs in and of themselves are not a major problem. Try to avoid flies and spiders, but because flies can carry disease and spiders can predate or feed on the good food soil web critters. So those spiders could be feeding on some of the decomposers that are helping to break food and organic matter down in your compost bin. But all other bugs have a great value to your compost bin. You want to have some bugs in your compost bin. But if you're seeing flies or if you're seeing spiders, maybe take out some of those problem feedstocks. You do not want to put meat in your compost bin. So if you've been adding meat, take away that meat. Take that meat out of the compost bin, and that will help to eliminate the fly problem. And if your food's not buried deep enough, add some more brown to cover up that food waste, and that will help to eliminate the flies that you're seeing in your compost bin. So while bugs are good to have, on the opposite end, we might have large animals that are hanging around our compost bin. So if we're seeing large animals such as mice or raccoons or armadillos or maybe even snakes, maybe some potential causes is maybe we've got some inappropriate greens in our compost bin, or maybe our food is not buried deep enough in our compost bin. Well, snakes and frogs and lizards, they're not necessarily bad for the compost pile. They prey on some insects, but that's not necessarily bad if you see snakes, frogs, and lizards. Now, rats and raccoons, they can run off with food. They can really create a big mess, a big problem with your compost pile, so they are not ideal. If you're seeing birds around your compost bin, they're looking for worms, and that's a good sign, because if you have earthworms in your compost, that's good. And those birds if you're seeing birds, they're looking for earthworms, so that's a great sign. And usually those birds don't do much harm. So if you're trying to get rid of some of those rats and raccoons, some solutions is maybe take out some of those problem feedstocks, take out some of those foods that those animals are looking for. Or you can certainly cover that food with more browns, with more carbons to cover all of that food waste. And that will help to eliminate those animals that are feeding in your compost bin. Well, you walk out to your compost bin and maybe you actually see little plants growing in your compost bin. Well, those little plants are the results of seeds from some composted fruits and vegetables. And seeing little seedlings in your compost bin is very common, even in the hot stage of your compost pile. But these little seedlings are using the goods, they're using the nutrients that you're trying to make in your compost pile. So that can potentially be a problem. So a solution, if you're seeing plant seedlings in your compost bin, is you can either take those seedlings and transplant them if you know what they are, or you can pull out the seedlings, snap them, and throw them back in your compost pile and let them decompose and return those nutrients back into the compost pile. There's a variety of different issues or problems that can happen in a compost bin. The thing to remember is that sometimes compost happens, but how you handle those situations in your compost bin can help make the difference between having good compost compared to compost that's maybe not so good. So knowing how to look for some of those signs of trouble and knowing how to solve those troubled compost piles can certainly help make your garden grow at the end of the day. If you would like more information on composting, you can certainly contact the Leon County Extension Office. We're located at 113 West Main in Centerville. You can log on to our website at leon.agrilife.org, or you can give us a call at 903-536-2531.